Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. I'm back for another video in my series on what sound engineers need to know. This is the series where I talk about the more controversial and often underappreciated facts about acoustics that you need to know, that are crucial, in fact, for you to know in order to make the acoustic treatment process a success. And in this particular video, I want to talk about why the mix volume, the volume that you are working at, is so important. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a quick how-to, a very simple step-by-step process for you to set your ideal mix volume and the two major things that you need to watch out for in order for this to actually work. So make sure you stick around for that. But before I do that, I want to help you out in treating your home studio. Oftentimes, it's so easy to get lost in all the different aspects of the treatment process. And that's why I created the Home Studio Treatment Framework that you can download for free at the link in the description. These are my 5 steps to systematically treat a home studio and get it to translate. So this is a step-by-step process, top level, that shows you what you need to focus on at what point in the treatment process, and what you actually need to think about and what to ignore in order to keep you from turning in circles and making sure that you actually do the right things, focus on the right things that actually matter. There are so many things that get talked about when you read online, when you watch YouTube videos, that are technically correct, but don't really apply in the grand context of treating a home studio. And so this is my process, the one that I use when I treat home studios, the one that I teach my students, to go through all the steps and make sure you actually get the results at the end. So it's all in there, setting up your listening position, setting up your speakers, how to obviously do that in a typical home studio scenario. So odd-shaped rooms, when you're not just working with a shoebox-shaped room, when you're dealing with windows and doors in inconvenient places. But beyond that, just how to go think about the treatment, porous treatment, but also pressure traps, so Helmholtz resonators, membrane traps, smaller things like speaker decoupling, but also how to think about integrating a subwoofer, what to do about measurements, how to best use acoustic measurements in this process, and obviously room correction as well. It's all in there, nicely laid out for you in a step-by-step process that you can follow from start to finish. So again, if you are in the process of treating your home studio and you're wondering what you need to focus on, or you've got a particular problem and you need to understand what it is you need to look at in order to solve that problem, make sure you download my Home Studio Treatment Framework at the link in the description. But with that, let's get back to talking about mix volume, right? So this is what I want to discuss with you because it is so crucial and often underestimated and often just kind of left to its own devices in a way, right? So what do I actually mean by setting the mix volume? Well, obviously I'm talking about the volume that you're getting from your speakers while you work. And this needs to be consistent. It needs to be constant throughout the mixing process. And I'm not saying that because you can somehow overpower the room. That's not actually a thing. It doesn't really exist. Or because you can somehow excite the room less. Yeah, I made a whole video about that you can check out in the card right now. Or that you can somehow reduce the effect of room modes. Yeah, these last two are acoustic effects that are actually independent of volume. Yeah, so none of these things from an acoustic perspective make a difference in terms of the volume that you're working at. The reason I'm saying this is purely psychoacoustic. And the major problem is that if we don't keep the volume in check, usually what happens is that throughout the session, we keep turning up the volume more and more, which is obviously bad for your hearing, for your ears, but it is also detrimental to the mixing process. And there are 2 reasons for this. The first one is that your perception of tonality, if you will, the frequency response of your hearing apparatus changes with volume. Maybe you've heard about the equal loudness contours or the Fletcher-Munson curves. These are basically frequency response graphs that describe how our hearing changes, or the tonality, the frequency response of our hearing changes with volume. And so obviously, if you're messing with the volume throughout your session, you're actually changing how you perceive the tonality of your music. And the second problem is that the way that you perceive dynamics also changes with volume. And maybe you've noticed this before, that if you listen at very quiet volumes, transients stand out much more. There's somehow way more awareness, or you can more easily hear the actual transient behavior of the music at low volumes. So that also changes with volume. And that's kind of where the problem arises from. If you're not keeping the volume constant throughout your session, you're changing both the frequency response and your perception of dynamics without actually realizing it. So as an analogy, just think about how people color grade film. Yeah. So imagine somebody who's trying to color grade a Hollywood movie, but the screen, the monitor, actually has a kind of green tint or some other color. It doesn't really matter. And in this scenario, they don't actually realize that it has a tint. But on top of that, it actually changes from a green tint to a blue tint to a yellow tint throughout their session, without them knowing that that's happening. And just imagine how difficult it is to actually color grade properly and consistently if that's happening. And that's what is happening with your perception of the music if you are constantly changing the volume. So that's why it's so important to keep the volume constant while you work. And obviously, acoustics, the treatment of your studio, also helps with this in some way, in an indirect way, right? Because a treated room will feel quieter. It will tend to have a lower noise floor. And so it is actually quieter. And because there is less distortion from the room, you are not trying to compensate that by turning up the volume. Because that's kind of the reason, or one of the reasons, why we tend to turn up the volume throughout our session. Our brain somehow tells us that we can hear better if we just turn it up a little bit, and then turn it up a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And that kind of effect doesn't happen quite so drastically, or you're not so prone to doing that if your room is actually treated. And I've heard from many people, and this is also my experience, that because the room is quieter, because there is less distortion from the room, you actually end up working at a quieter volume because you don't need to turn it up that far. So that's kind of the indirect benefit of the acoustic treatment. So let's talk about how to actually set up and work at a constant volume. How do you actually do that? Well, let's first think about what the ideal mix volume actually is. And the true answer, the honest answer, is there is no objectively correct mix volume to work at. It is entirely dependent on what you like. Yeah, just as a kind of a quick story, I remember visiting one of my mastering engineers a while back, spent some time with him. I actually planned to do an interview with him, forgot to set up the camera, and then basically had a 2-hour discussion with him without filming anything. And then afterwards, I was just like, oh, fuck, I screwed it up. So nothing came of that. But the point that I want to make is that when he showed me his work process, I was so surprised by how quiet he actually works. It was so quiet that even just talking at a simple volume like this was too loud to then hear the music. That's how quiet it was. It was just above kind of the threshold of hearing in a way. It was incredible. But that gave him just the right combination of tonality and transient perception for him to do his job properly. So just as an example of how quiet you could go with this. And obviously, the quieter you go, the better for your ears. Ear fatigue is a real thing. And it accumulates over time as well, right? So the quieter you work, the better it is overall. That said, again, what mix volume should you work at? Well, a volume that is comfortable for you, right? So how do you set this up? Well, it's pretty simple. Basically, at the start of your session, before your ears have already gone into some sort of fatigue, you load up your DAW, you load up a few reference tracks, and then the important thing is to first set the volume of these reference tracks. I like to use clip gain to a volume that measures the right LUFS, the right integrated loudness on your master bus. And I'll get to why that is so important in a second, right? But basically, you want to set a target loudness, integrated loudness on your mix bus, and you just want to adjust the clip gain of your reference tracks until you get that particular LU loudness unit setting on your mix bus. Yeah, so typically minus 18 LU. I like to actually go minus 23 LU. Doesn't really matter. Yeah, you just pick one that works for you, and then you turn up the volume of your speakers while you play the reference tracks to the point where it feels comfortable to you. Yeah, not too loud, not too quiet, somewhere where you feel you can really hear the music properly and it won't destroy your ears if you listen to that volume for the next 2 hours. And that's it. Now you've basically found the setting of your volume knob for your speakers at which that loudness on your mix bus gives you the right volume, the right mix volume from your speakers. Yeah, that's all you have to do. And now the great thing is that in order to now work at a constant volume going forward, all you need to do is make sure you keep your volume knob at that setting. Maybe you can use a marker to draw a little line, or if it's a purely digital setting, make sure you save that in your template or you make a note of it somewhere. Basically, you don't change the volume knob at that point. And now all you have to do is, and this is kind of the tricky part, is while you're mixing, you constantly have to aim for that loudness unit volume on your mix bus. That's the secret to this process. Back in the days with mixing consoles, engineers used to do this automatically because they worked with the VU meter, and that automatically gave them a volume to aim for in terms of their mix bus. And then if they didn't change the volume of their speakers, they were effectively working at a constant volume. We now have to do that somewhat more artificially because we tend to not work with VU meters anymore. And because of the nature of digital, there is a much larger span of volume that we can work at without any compromise, basically in quality. So you need to set that yourself. And that's the process that you need to train yourself in order to actually get the right volume on your mix bus. But that's pretty much it. It's just those two aspects that you need to control in order to mix at a constant volume. It's the level at your mix bus, best set and measured in loudness units, and then the setting on your loudspeaker volume knob. That's it. That's all you got to do. And obviously the great thing is that you can now also reference at the same volume. All you got to do is pull in your reference tracks into your session, set them at the same LUFS on your mix bus, and now you can actually do apples to apples comparison between your mix and your reference tracks. And because we're so sensitive to volume, if your reference tracks are only half a dB, 1 decibel louder, you will prefer how they sound and you will not have a proper comparison between your work and the reference tracks. That's why it's so important to actually set the level of them correctly. And now all you got to do is make sure you're hitting that same number on the mix bus and you're good to go. It's simple. But do you agree or disagree? Do you work at a constant volume already? What is your experience with this? Please let me know in the comments. But with that, let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.